They told you the New Deal saved America. They said Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the man who rescued capitalism from its own collapse, who tamed Wall Street and gave power back to the people. But that's the lie. Because behind the murals, the alphabet agencies, and the myth of the working man's revival, something else was being built. Something permanent. Something that would outlive FDR, outlive the Depression, and quietly seize control of the American financial system for nearly a century. This wasn't just a recovery plan. It was the creation of a new power structure, one that fused government, finance, and bureaucracy into a single, unaccountable machine. And if you've ever wondered why your money, your debt, your freedom to live outside the system always seems to shrink, it started here. This is the dark origin story of what we now call the deep state of finance. So let's go back, not to the myth, but to the machinery beneath it. The year was 1933. The United States was paralyzed. 1 out of every 4 workers was jobless. Banks were collapsing by the thousands, savings wiped out overnight. Ordinary Americans, the ones who'd believed in the system, stood in breadlines while Wall Street men who'd lost fortunes plotted their next move in private clubs. The country wasn't just broke, it was broken. Then came Roosevelt, charming, confident, smiling through the chaos. His message was simple: we're going to rebuild. But rebuild what exactly? To the public, the New Deal looked like hope. The Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, public works, jobs, and relief. A benevolent government reaching out to save its people. But behind the curtain, the New Deal was not just about saving the poor. It was about saving the financial system itself by rebuilding its architecture under federal control. The bankers had failed. The market had imploded. Confidence in capitalism was collapsing. So Roosevelt did something extraordinary. He didn't destroy Wall Street. He nationalized its failures and absorbed its power into Washington. That's the secret nobody tells you. The New Deal didn't end the rule of finance. It institutionalized it. It made it bureaucratic, permanent, hidden behind law, regulation, and alphabet agencies. In short, FDR didn't kill the financial elite. He gave them an office in the federal government. Let's start with the first great move, the Emergency Banking Act of 1933. In the popular story, this law stopped bank runs and restored confidence. FDR went on the radio, told everyone the banks were safe, and America believed him. But what really happened? The act gave the president sweeping powers to control the entire banking system. It allowed the government, specifically the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, to decide which banks lived and which died. Overnight, private finance was no longer just private, it was fused with state power. Then came the Glass-Steagall Act, often remembered as a noble wall between Main Street banks and Wall Street speculators. And yes, it imposed limits. But it also created the FDIC, a mechanism that guaranteed deposits using government backing. Sounds fair, right? Except that meant the risks of private banking were now socialized. The profits remained private. The losses became public. A precedent was born. That's the same logic that bailed out Wall Street in 2008. It was written in the DNA of the New Deal. And here's the real twist. Glass-Steagall didn't weaken the financial elite. It formalized their relationship with the state. It made them a partner, indispensable to the machinery of national recovery. From that moment forward, the American financial system was no longer governed solely by markets. It was governed by alliances between bureaucrats, bankers, and policy architects who would become the permanent managers of the economy. The era of free market capitalism quietly ended in 1933. The era of managed finance began. If the banking reforms fused Wall Street and Washington, Roosevelt's next move welded them together permanently. On April 5, 1933, he signed Executive Order 6102. Most Americans have never heard of it, but it was one of the most radical acts in US history. It made it illegal for private citizens to own gold. Think about that. Overnight, the government seized the very asset that had anchored personal financial sovereignty for centuries. The message was clear: from now on, your wealth belongs to the system. Gold was called in, bought at $20.67 per ounce. Then, just months later, the government revalued it to $35, a 69% increase. The profit didn't go to the people. It went to the government's new financial base, the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, and the banks they backstopped. That's how Roosevelt quietly recapitalized the financial system, not through taxes, not through markets, but through expropriation. The gold seizure was the spiritual birth of the deep state of finance, because for the first time, the line between your personal savings and the state's financial machinery disappeared. You didn't own money anymore, you owned permission. Permission to use the state's currency, the one they could devalue, inflate, or manipulate at will. And once that line was crossed, it would never be restored. By 1935, the New Deal had transformed from a relief program into something much bigger, a web of bureaucratic empires. Each new agency, the SEC, the FDIC, the Fannie Maes and Fannie Freddies of their day, wasn't just a government office, it was a permanent interface between money and power. The Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, claimed to regulate Wall Street. But who staffed it? Former bankers, lawyers, and insiders. The same people who'd broken the system were now writing the rules of its reform. That's how the deep state operates, not by breaking the law, but by becoming the law. The Tennessee Valley Authority, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the Federal Housing Administration, all of them created new flows of government-backed credit. They didn't just distribute money, they directed it, choosing which industries, which corporations, which sectors would rise or fall. And in that moment, American capitalism became something new. State capitalism. It was no longer a contest of innovation or competition. It was a contest of access. Access to federal money, federal contracts, federal guarantees. The invisible hand of the market was replaced by the invisible handshake of Washington finance. Then came World War II. If the New Deal built the deep state, the war industrialized it. In 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9024, creating the War Production Board. This body effectively took control of the entire American economy: steel, oil, shipping, labor, even advertising. It wasn't the private sector driving growth anymore. It was government contracts, military procurement, and centralized coordination, a nationalized version of capitalism. But here's the catch: when the war ended, that system didn't die. The bureaucrats didn't disband, the bankers didn't step aside. The networks forged between finance, industry, and government hardened into something immovable. The same men who'd managed wartime production went on to run peacetime finance. The same agencies that rationed materials began rationing credit. The same bankers who'd advised Roosevelt on recovery now advised Truman on the Marshall Plan. The deep state of finance had gone global, because in 1944, as the war was winding down, representatives from 44 nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The United States, flush with gold and industrial dominance, took the lead. What they created there was the crown jewel of FDR's financial architecture, the Bretton Woods system. It pegged global currencies to the US dollar and the dollar to gold. But remember, the US government already controlled the gold, meaning the world's financial future now ran through Washington, through the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, and the network of bankers and bureaucrats born from the New Deal. The free world economy wasn't free at all. It was centrally managed, globally denominated, and permanently dependent on American financial power. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's the architecture of the modern world. You might be thinking, all of this happened nearly a century ago. Why does it matter now? Because you still live inside that system. The same mechanisms Roosevelt created: government-backed credit, bank guarantees, centralized monetary control, are the bones of the modern financial order. Every time the Fed intervenes, every time Washington stimulates, every time a bailout saves a corporation too big to fail, you're seeing the New Deal's ghost at work. The alphabet soup may have changed, but the logic is identical. Power is centralized, risk is socialized, wealth is financialized. The deep state of finance doesn't need secret meetings or conspiracies. It's structural, it's bureaucratic, it's systemic. It doesn't rule through ideology, but through inertia, through the belief that the system must be preserved at all costs. And you, the modern citizen, are trapped in its machinery. Your mortgage, your 401k, your digital dollar, all of them depend on a web of guarantees and controls that trace directly back to Roosevelt's reforms. The irony: the man who promised to liberate the American people from Wall Street dependence ended up binding them to it forever. If you look closely, history didn't stop repeating itself. It just changed the actors. In 2008, when the financial system once again collapsed under its own greed, Washington didn't dismantle it. It absorbed it. Again, just as FDR had in 1933. The same pattern repeated. Private failures nationalized, public guarantees expanded, and the bureaucracy of finance grew even deeper, more technical, more entrenched. Today, when you hear about quantitative easing, liquidity operations, or central bank digital currencies, you're not hearing innovation. You're hearing the echo of the New Deal, the eternal promise that the state will save the system even if it means owning it. That's the real continuity. That's the deep state of finance. It doesn't wear a party label. It doesn't campaign. It just persists, across administrations, across crises, across generations. The greatest illusion of all is that we, the people, still have agency over our economic lives. We talk about free markets and private enterprise, but our money, our credit, our savings, they all exist inside a framework of control built in the 1930s. Your bank account exists at the pleasure of the Federal Reserve's policies. Your investments rise and fall on signals from central banks. Your government debt, your nation's currency, your personal wealth, all orbit the same sun, the financial deep state Roosevelt forged under the banner of democracy. And it's brilliant in its design, because it doesn't feel like tyranny, it feels like stability. The system doesn't tell you what to do, it just limits your choices until compliance feels like freedom. You can invest, but only in dollar-denominated assets. You can save, but only through banks that serve the Fed's balance sheet. You can work, but your wages are priced in a currency that loses value by design. That's the genius of it. The cage is invisible. So what's the lesson in all this? That the New Deal didn't just save capitalism. It transformed it into something unrecognizable, a managed, bureaucratized system where power and money are no longer separate. It created a financial architecture that looks democratic on the surface, but operates like a technocracy beneath. It made every future crisis an opportunity for more centralization, more control, more integration between state and finance. And every time a politician promises to rein in Wall Street, remember this: that's what Roosevelt said too. And instead, he built its empire. You live in the shadow of that empire today. You feel it when your cost of living rises faster than your income. You feel it when your savings earn less than inflation. You feel it when markets crash. And yet the same elites, the same institutions, always land safely. That's not an accident. That's the architecture doing what it was designed to do. So what can you do? You can learn how it was built. You can understand the machinery instead of worshipping the myth. Because once you see how the deep state of finance was created, you can start seeing its patterns and maybe, just maybe, find your way out of its illusions. The New Deal didn't end in 1945. It's still here, in your wallet, in your taxes, in every interest rate and bailout and budget debate. It's the quiet empire of managed money, and until you understand it, you'll always mistake control for freedom. Because the real lesson of FDR's New Deal is this: he didn't rescue the people from the bankers. He made sure the bankers would never need rescuing again. That's how the New Deal created the deep state of finance. And it's why, 90 years later, you're still living in it.